From 2018 to 2019, Dr. Ho was an instructor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. From 2019 to 2022, Dr. Ho was an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California at San Francisco. Dr. Ho's research has been generously funded by the Klingenstein Third Generation Foundation and National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Ho, everybody.
Thank you so much for this warm introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you all about mental health.
Yes, thank you so much. So I just wanted to have some questions for you. What kind of research are you doing right now?
So I primarily utilize tools from cognitive neuroscience to better understand how stress affects the brain, especially during periods of rapid development such as adolescence, and to see whether or not stress programming or influences on the brain contribute to the risk of depression, suicide, and other related conditions. I have multiple different projects in the lab that speak or are focused on these topics. But I would say right now, the biggest pillar in my lab is a study looking at how inflammatory markers, which we know rise in response to stress, how those are affecting glutamate as well as other neurotransmitters in the brain, and if one's response to stress for these processes can predict whether or not they will respond well to antidepressants, which typically are acting on serotonin. So in addition to that, we are also trying to understand what are some barriers for youth in the community to be taking antidepressants. So we are conducting focus groups and qualitative assessments to better understand really what are some of the reasons why someone would not want to take an antidepressant, and what are some barriers that could be sort of addressed. And then other research that we do is really just more mechanistic, right? How does stress affect our thoughts, our perceptions of others? How does early life adversity affect stress biology? And again, I just want to return to this idea of brain development. The reason why I study teenagers is because their brains are developing so quickly. And although that could mean it is a time of risk, because their brains are so sensitive to environmental input, if they're surrounded by negative input, that could put them on a poor trajectory. But at the same time, I want us to remind ourselves of how this could be a period of resilience, right? If they've experienced early life adversity, and now as a teenager are surrounded by positive experiences, positive influences, you now have this opportunity to rework and rewire what was done earlier on in life. And I think that's very hopeful. And my goal really with my research is to build a neuroscience of resilience as well as understanding stress. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, I appreciate that your research target population is the youth, because we need that nowadays. Obviously, I think they go through the most challenges in their developmental years, myself included as well. And I like the fact that your research focuses on biological factors along with environmental factors. Like you said, their environment, their upbringing, everything is part of the equation. And that should take into account what kind of dosage we give them, what kind of drugs we give them, or what kind of other treatments that doesn't involve drugs as well.
Right, exactly. I mean, again, the environment, broadly defined, is affecting one's biology. And there are other things that also affect one's biology. It could be drugs, but it also can be lifestyle-based interventions. So for instance, we know that sleep, high-quality sleep, is anti-inflammatory. We know that diet, nutrition, exercise, all of these things can act in concert or even separately from antidepressants to ameliorate stress. So that's what a lot of my work is hoping to cover in the future.
Gotcha. And the next question I have is, what are some of the key findings from your research if you'd like to share with everyone?
Yes, so some of the findings really have to do with how stress involves or upregulates inflammation, right, in the body, and I think we all know this intuitively. but really mapping out how does this inflammation in your body get into your brain, right? These proteins are crossing the blood-brain barrier. It's affecting certain neurotransmitters, certain brain circuits. And the other piece that we're trying to understand is adversity, how these different types are also affecting these same processes. Now, I recruit depressed adolescents for the studies in my lab. Unfortunately, many of them have experienced pretty severe childhood maltreatment. And we are, as a field, trying to understand how different types of adversity might affect the brain, depending on the timing, depending on whether or not the individual is a boy or a girl. And I suppose one example is was talked about sort of briefly in the documentary. But there is a difference between abuse and harm, which is the presence of something negative, right? Contrasting with experiences of neglect or deprivation. You know, the baby who's crying but is not being soothed. That's the absence of something positive. And a lot of our work has shown that abuse and neglect have actually distinct effects on the brain, depending on whether or not you're female or male, and also depending on the timing of those adversities relative to that person's development, right? Earlier on, during adolescence, or perhaps later on. And a paper that is currently under review, hopefully it will be published by the end of the year. I'm happy to share it once it is. It's a large-scale study where we had over, I think, 4,000 individuals with brain scans, and we were finding that females, their brains seem to be particularly sensitive to the effects of abuse. Neglect, on the other hand, seems to be affecting both sexes and is influencing diffuse parts of the brain. Abuse, on the other hand, does appear to be more localized to certain circuits, those that are involved with fear and stress processing. So those are some of the findings so far. As I mentioned before, we are running a study right now on biomarkers of antidepressant response. No findings yet. We're still looking for participants. So I also have flyers for that study if anyone knows of anyone who is between the ages of 14 and 21 who could qualify. But I'm happy to pass around those later on, and also happy to answer any questions about sort of the thinking behind that work and what we hypothesize we'll find.
Yes, so if you, yes, we have a question.
Yes.
I have one observation is, first it talks about your people work about the stress among the young people there. When you study, is there any ethnicity factor such as the Asian population compared with the other population like Caucasian population? Because the culture of the Asian people is quite different.
Right.
You know, let's say young student just bring home the school report. The mother look at the school report and said some point is not so good. That one comment such as you're not doing good. So the boy or the student will feel bad. But you will say everything look good, but it can be better if you do this way. So the approach is different. The Asian people tend to be rude and little things so.
So according to Asian culture, people, I think, like Vietnamese people tend to show more tough love, right? And then that creates the upbringing of the child. Maybe they experience tougher things, like if a child falls down in the mall, then their mom might just tell them to get up instead of going over and patting them and everything. So I guess this question is like, how do you see the culture of specifically Asian culture influences the mental health of the youth?
I think this is such an excellent question. You know, one of the stress tests that we run in our lab is a math test. And you can imagine for certain individuals that's not very stressful, and for others it may be. And we do collect information on race and ethnicity, perhaps not so much on culture in the studies that we're running in the lab so far, as well as previous data from a similar study that I've been conducting at Stanford. But I'm very fortunate to be working with brilliant trainees and graduate students who are interested in those exact questions. So we are now analyzing the data and seeing whether or not stress responsivity or stress biology, as well as perceptions of stress, if they're even correlated, and if those correlations depend on one's ethnicity. So being from the Bay Area, I am fortunate that I was able to recruit quite a few non-Caucasian study participants. In fact, I think it was a little bit over 50%. Now, out of that bubble, we had perhaps about 30 to 40% who were Asian or mixed. So certainly not as large as I would like to be able to look at these specific questions. But my hope here with the study that I'm now running at UCLA is to recruit a diverse population. And so again, I welcome any thoughts that you may have also on how to best reach those who have historically been underrepresented in research.
And that follows up with my next question for you, which is, why did you choose teenagers as the demographic for your research?
That's a great question. So one of the reasons is because the onset of depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts and behaviors tends to emerge during the adolescent period. And again, this is a period of risk, but I want us to remember that it is also a time where if we were to intervene early, there could be lifelong benefits. We can yield the greatest clinical gains. And so that is why my hope is to use the findings from neuroscience to make an impact as soon as we can. I was able to work with the treatment-resistant depression clinic at UCSF back when I was in the Department of Psychiatry there. And treatment resistance here is defined as not responding to an antidepressant or other first-line therapy at least twice. So we often saw patients who were chronically ill on various medications, even using brain stimulation techniques, nothing was working. These patients, all of them were older and have been battling depression for decades and decades. Every single one of those patients, first onset of depression was during high school or college, right? So if we can make a difference early on, we wouldn't be seeing those kinds of patients, right? Who ineffectively treated depression is going to impact the brain. Being on the wrong type of medication or treatment is also going to have side effects and affect the brain. So we really want to make sure that we can help those whose brains are more responsive, right? Teens, again, have plastic brains, for better or for worse. But that means that if we can put in positive inputs and get them on the right treatments, the ones that work best for their illness, we can change their lives.
That's amazing, honestly. I think that is extremely beneficial and meaningful. And like you said, teenagers' brains are in the phase where they're growing and changing the most and developing the most. So that is extremely meaningful. And I wanted to ask you about your lab name. So the acronym is CANDY Lab.
I like candy. I like sugar.
And it actually stands for Cognition Affect and Neurodevelopment in Youth. And it says candy, so that's perfect for the target audience that we're attracting, right? Can you share a little bit about the CANDY Lab and your recruitment process?
Recruitment in terms of study participants or, okay, got it. So the lab right now is growing. I joined UCLA about 3 years ago, and I think it just takes time to get to know a new community, a new environment and institution. I'm very fortunate to have postdoctoral scientists, clinical collaborators, graduate students in both clinical psychology and in neuroscience, as well as undergraduates in all of these different fields working in the lab, working together to better understand how does stress impact the brain and how can we ameliorate its toxic effects. So in terms of recruiting for study participants, we've been advertising primarily on social media. We would like to go out to different communities, perhaps visit high schools, and also, partner with, folks such as yourselves, organizations, mental health agencies to better see where would be a good place, right, to be talking about these studies. And I think, again, stigma does play a big role. I can imagine many of the Asian American community, they may not want to participate in such a study because they think it's associated with something that is not quite palpable. But I'm just here to share that this is really, I believe, innovative neuroscience that we are doing. And even though we're not offering treatment, The studies that we do sort of bridge basic science and translational science. The hope is that we would use these foundational discoveries to help improve treatments down the road. And we do try to pay quite well for these studies also because we understand it is a lot of time. We cover all transportation costs. We try to do everything that we can to make the participants' lives as easy as possible. But yeah, if you have any suggestions on where would be a good place to recruit or advertise such a study, please let me know. I understand in Los Angeles and in the surrounding areas, traffic is really, I've never seen anything like it. Even getting here today took twice as long as I had guessed or as Google told me. But we partner with Lyft to make sure that we can cover all of that. And we are willing to recruit all the way as far south as San Diego to as far north as Santa Barbara. So again, if you know of anyone who potentially could be eligible for this study or some of the studies in our lab, please let me know. Questions?
Can you just briefly talk about what the study entails in one word in it, kind of just a rough idea, time, how long?
Sure, yeah, I can grab some flyers that are actually in my car because it will lay out the eligibility criteria. So first, someone would need to be between the ages of 14 and 21, clinically depressed, and prescribed one of two antidepressants. So either Prozac, fluoxetine, or escitalopram, Lexapro. They would obviously have to be under the care of a clinician. And then the study itself is technically 18 months long, but it's really the first 3 months that are most intensive. So all clinical assessments happen over Zoom, where we interview the individual, and if they're under 18, their parent as well, to get a sense of their clinical history, their current levels of functioning. And then we bring them to the scanner where they get their brain scanned and they provide blood samples so we can look at inflammation and other markers of stress. And so that actually is happening at USC, so it's, I think, easier to get to than UCLA. And then from there, we have the participant then take their antidepressant under the instructions of their provider. And after 3 months, we do the same thing. So we have them undergo their clinical assessment, come back to USC, do the brain scan, give us some biospecimens, and then every 3 months thereafter, for the remaining 15 months, it's all clinical assessments over Zoom. So really the first 3 months are really where a lot of the more, I don't want to say burden, but more of the effort is put in. And again, we just want to see whether or not there's anything at baseline prior to taking the antidepressant in one's biology or even in their perceptions that could predict how they will do on this drug and also their longer term functioning over 18 months. And after 3 months, it really is up to them and their care provider if they want to continue on with the antidepressant. There are some people who do, and there are some people who don't. And we collect information on why someone may decide to cease or switch medications. All of that, I think, is meaningful and important as well. So that's really the point of that study.
Can you talk about, so I understand that you are working on using technology
Yes.
to part of your study. Can you talk about the mobile app and all that?
Yes, I totally forgot about that particular study. So we are still trying to launch this study called, well, the first study that I just talked about is called TIGER. So that stands for Teen Inflammation Glutamate Emotion Research. So I hope that mnemonic sticks in your mind and is easy to remember. This project that Duc is talking about is called Tiger Ears. And Ears is a smartphone app that was developed by a professor at the University of Oregon, Dr. Nicholas Allen. And this app takes advantage of the sensors on your smartphone to get a sense of your digital phenotype. So how you're moving, right, because there's GPS on the phone, even the orientation of your phone, combining that information with the time of day, you can get a rough estimate of how long somebody is sleeping, for instance. The speed at which you're typing on your phone's keyboard, as well as the content of what you're typing. So whether it's negative or positive, all of that is giving us insight into one's cognition and affect and behaviors outside of the lab. What's great about this smartphone app Ears is that we're allowing people to interact naturalistically with their phone. So it's not like we're pinging them to do a survey, right, and asking them 20 times a day, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? they're just using the phone as they normally would. And so all of this information is getting passively collected, and using very fancy algorithms and machine learning, we can then start generating a profile, right? Is this someone who's anxious? Is this someone who's withdrawn? Is this someone who's depressed? This Tiger Ears project, we are really trying to see whether or not these digital phenotypes or profiles I just described can actually map onto certain brain circuits or alterations in brain circuits. So you can imagine if someone is anxious, right, that would be implicating a different brain circuit with different neurotransmitters, as opposed to someone who might be depressed or manic. So this is something that we're hoping to continue doing, and we're launching that hopefully at the end of this year or the beginning of next year.
All right, well, that's awesome. I just have one final question for you for today's conversation. So everything you said was amazing. It sounds like it's a very innovative research, and I wish you a lot of luck with everything. As someone who is an expert in the brain, in the mind, and cognition and everything, what is one thing that you would like to share with our audience today as a takeaway?
Oh, as a takeaway, okay. Mental health is physical health. This is the cornerstone of health, and we shouldn't think of them as separate entities. So when you take care of your mind, you are taking care of your body. Because the work that I do shows that there is a very strong connection. If you're perceiving danger and perceiving stress, it activates the immune system in the same way that a pathogen would. And that has severe downstream consequences on your body and on your brain. So you need to be taking care of your mental health if you want to be taking care of your physical health. And this is why with depression, we often see physical comorbidities, right? Those patients I was describing earlier at UCSF, the treatment-resistant depression clinic, decades of depression and also other physical conditions that they're dealing with. And at that point, it becomes so hard to treat them. So we don't want to consider these as distinct. They're all entangled and all connected together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tiffany Ho.